ASU. Um, and then, yeah, I've been publishing my own books for 12 years now. So my first story collection came out in 2010 on a very small independent press, like small enough that it was like a person, right? Which was one kind of publishing experience. It was, great, but also like very kind of punk do it yourself kind of thing. And then my novels and short story collections have come up for the last couple of years, mostly on Soho Press in New York City, who published Refused to Be Done. And then my most recent novel, Appleseed, came out on Collins in July. So I've had a chance to work with a lot of different kinds of publishers. I was also an editor myself at a literary nonfiction press called Dzank Books that's based in Detroit. I worked there for about 4 years. And I also worked as a literary magazine editor for quite some time.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So tell us a little bit about how did the Soho crime publisher publish a book on writing?
Right. I'm glad they wanted to do it because I didn't necessarily expect they would. So Soho has Soho Crime, and they have that's really just called Soho, I think, that is like the literary fiction side, which is where my books have mostly been published. And then they also have now Soho, a YA imprint as well. So they have sort of some different parts to it. And so I did 3 books with them on the sort of literary side, although a lot of my work is a crossover in some ways, is often speculative or fantastical. And one of my novels is a sort of literary crime novel. But yeah, they had never done a craft book like this. They don't really do nonfiction kind of at all.
Right.
So I think one of the things I guess I'm just lucky about is that we've been working together for 10 years. And kind of a long relationship that let them take a bet on this, which I really appreciate. And it was good to get to work with them. It was nice to edit a book about editing novels with an editor I'd worked with for 10 years, right? I mean, it was nice to continue our sort of collaboration, talking about craft in the novel. I know there are things that are in this book that wouldn't be there if I hadn't had the conversations I'd had with my editor, Mark Doughton, there. So it was good to get to do that with him. I'm glad that got to be the case. But yeah, I think it's a weird project for them. So hopefully they're not losing their shirt or anything,
Matt, you start out early in the book with this statement. What I've found is that over-planning before beginning writing risks blocking opportunities for discovery and surprise. And I'm looking at a bunch of people who I'm sure have blocked, storybooked, posted it, their outlines. Unpack that statement and talk a little bit about your exploratory draft that you referenced.
Yeah, absolutely. I teach these novel writing workshops, which are generative in nature. We start from 0. So everybody comes in with no words, and then we write a certain amount of words every week through the semester together. One of the things that's been interesting to watch students, these MFA students do in that process is explore as they go and sort of figure out as they go. And even when they have outlines, the outlines often don't last very long, right? The book starts becoming something else, and that being able to adjust as your outline grows. I think a lot about a Richard Hugo essay called The Triggering Town. It's about poetry, but Hugo talks about how like every poem has a triggering subject. There's like a reason you start to write it. And somewhere in the poem, it wants to make a turn toward its like true subject, the thing it's like really about. And an inability to turn toward the true subject like ruins the poem. And there's a version of that in novel writing, whether you start with the outline or not, that you do eventually, usually your book becomes something else. And if you won't go with it, you end up kind of stuck. I think for me, when I say an exploratory draft, I mean, I know I'm writing things that aren't going to be in the final book, but they're part of me discovering the characters and discovering the world of the book. Sometimes that means writing backstory, that like flashbacks that can't possibly, too many flashbacks that can be in the final book. My novel Appleseed at one point had like 4 prologues. And I knew like a novel can't have 4 prologues, I'm pretty sure. Some people would argue you can't have 1. And I knew what I was really doing was I was just going back from the main story, right? I was learning about what was behind me by writing it. And that was still really useful work. I see in my students like first chapters, like multiple starts, right? The book starts and then starts and then starts again. You feel that like the true start hasn't been found, or a character will speak and then they'll like remember for 3 pages. And if you're Virginia Woolf, that's just how a novel works. But for most of us, that's not. And I think what they're doing, though, is discovering why their characters are doing what they're doing. Later, that stuff will be taken out, but they have to write it to know it. And that's kind of what I mean about exploratory first draft. There's that you know, Hemingway, like the novel's an iceberg and you only see the tip of it, right? And the real story is like below. This part where you're exploring is you making the iceberg, right? Like it's sort of, it's the thing that your book will be, the reader will feel that, and you have to actually generate it. I think I didn't understand that for a long time. I thought you were just supposed to be like really smart and only write the tip of the iceberg. And I think if you can get away with that, do it, but I can't. And so this is sort of the way I build that material. Does that make sense, Don?
Yeah, you make a very brash statement that made me shudder, and I think many will. You made one of the lines, one of the key takeaways of your book is rewrite, don't revise.
Yeah.
And you like talk about that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the central thing maybe I've learned as a writer is that it's easier to write a new version of a scene than to tinker a bad scene into a good one. That, you know, and I think in the same at the sentence level, and for me the same at the novel level. I write this exploratory first draft, and then when that's done is actually when I do my outlining. I outline what I've written, so I make this kind of reverse engineered outline of the novel. I edit that outline into a plan for like a better structured, better plotted book, and then I rewrite the book entirely in the second draft. I do let myself use stuff from the first draft, but I make myself retype it. That copying and pasting is not editing. That rewriting is editing. And for me, the real reason that works is I think what Amy Tan says about it is like you're writing in the voice of all that's happened. Like, you know the story now, and you know the characters, and you know the voice of the book. And so instead of trying to find it, you're writing from it. I write first drafts often non-linearly. I write second drafts like beginning to end, right? Like it's a different project for me. But even then, you know, in that draft, there'll be scenes that like just don't work or are conceived wrong in some ways. And it's very hard to just like move the commas around until it's right. Like that doesn't really work. But sometimes like analyzing why it doesn't work and rewriting it is more successful for me. More often than not, that tends to be the case. And when I do get lazy and I'm just like, this is good enough, or I'll just import this from the first draft and I won't do it too much, I like the scene, I inevitably end up having to do that work anyway. Because as you're rewriting, you know, if it takes me a year to write a first draft and a year to rewrite the second draft, you just get so much better at writing the book you're writing, that like that second draft is so much stronger. That yeah, I really do it for almost everything. I may do it for short stories, I do it for essays. Like it's really like the payoff is so huge that I very rarely skip that part of the process for anything that matters anyway.
You talk about a concept you call islands.
Yeah.
Do you want to unpack that a little bit?
Sure. This comes from novelist Charlie Smith. I heard it from another novelist, Natalie Bacopoulos. I think it feels like one of these things that's like passed down from people. But Charlie Smith has this idea of writing the islands in a first draft. And the islands are the part of the story you can see now, even if you don't know how the whole book works. So you have in your head some scene that you're like writing the book so you can write that scene, right? Or you're like trying to get to that scene, or I can see just into like nodding and smiling, right? You know, it's like we all have this, like we know what your islands are. And Smith says like, write those first. You know, write the things that are most exciting to you, the things that feel most pressing. And then one thing you can do is just like figure out how to connect the islands, right? You just have to get to them once they're written. I think the other part of it is I write very bad prose sometimes, and I'm doing that. Like, I just want to get to this part I really want to write. I write all this stuff I don't want to write, trying to get there. Much of it ends up being pulled out anyway. And so I think, you know, like to skip that and just go to the part you like is useful. And I also think as soon as you get the good thing out of your head, it makes room for like the next good thing. Like there will be more scenes of that quality. The big fear usually is that you don't know how to write that scene yet, or you don't totally know what happens in it. You like kind of know it, right? Well, you'll come to know it by writing it. And also in my mode of working, you're going to rewrite it anyway. So like, you're not going to ruin it by writing it. You're going to take a first stab at it by writing it. And so like, the sooner you get the stuff you really want to put in your book, the more you'll like the book you're writing.
So Matt, I've read your book. I've followed all your tips, chapter by chapter, section by section. And then the novel turns out shitty.
Right.
What then?
You buy a second copy of the book and you start the process over. And no. You do drafts 4, 5, and 6. It's really easy.
So I have now a bookshelf of yellow spined books.
Right.
Awesome.
I think after like your 6th copy, I'll just give you your money back. No, it does happen, of course, like books don't turn out right. I wrote 2 novels before the novel I published, and novels I never even showed anybody. I just sort of knew they were not the books I was writing, and I worked really hard on those books. It happens, but I think a book that you could go through this whole process with is going to turn out reasonably well. It may not be the everything you want it to be. That's why we have to write more books. If I could write my perfect novel, I could stop, right? Like you just be like, I did it. One of the reasons to write more books is that you didn't finish the job in some ways. But I also think, and this is like a real focus for me, is like publishing is great, and I'm very lucky to have published as many books as I have, and I'm lucky to have those have readers. But the publishing process is not always the part that makes you feel the best, and is not actually the most enjoyable in some ways. And the real rewards are like the things that happen to you at the desk. And I think about the things I've written novels about that mattered a lot to me, and that writing those books and staying with the problems of the book was a way of staying with my own thoughts and my own feelings for that period of time. My last book took 3.5 years before I sent it to my agent. Took 5 years before it showed up on bookshelves. And it was about climate change and my relationship to like the non-human and the environment and the natural world, and manifest destiny in the book of Genesis and all these things, right? And this 5 years I spent trying to figure out where the commas go were also me like thinking about those things and feeling about those things. And that experience was invaluable. That's the life-changing part, right? I have a novel that fell apart a couple of years ago, like halfway through. I was just out of my cultural depth. The more research I did, the more I realized I was not the person who should write this book, right? It was just like not going to be a good idea. But I think about the things I thought about when I was working the book all the time. Like it changed my approach to the world to have written that failed novel. So it wasn't really a failure, right? Like that was a good way to have spent a year, even if I didn't have anything to mail my agent at the end of the year, right? But I don't know. I feel the success of the process of writing can't be like, does the book sell, or how many copies does it sell, in that way. For most of us aren't going to like lose our house if we don't finish our novel, right? Like most of us are not in that kind of writing scenario. It's something different. So yeah, I don't know. I think putting that sort of pressure of like the publishing success on the writing process is usually in the way of the writing process, which I know is in some ways a silly thing to say as we're all sitting here in Don's room, if you're all talking about publishing, but I do think it, even in that space, like to keep your focus where it belongs is important.
Not everyone on the screen this morning, Matt, are fiction writers specifically. So what is a tip or some tips you would give for all writers, whether they're poets, nonfiction, just to encourage them in the writing process? Yeah,
I mean, I think some of the like the triggering town thing we were talking about is like that, comes from poetry and applies widely. One of my favorite like late stage revision practices, and I do this in everything I write. I do this in my academic critical writing. I do it in my memoir writing. Is I go through the manuscript with like a highlighter, usually on paper, but sometimes on like on like the iPad or something, right? Just something where you can highlight. And I highlight the weakest sentence in every paragraph, and then I delete them all. And the hope is that you can just delete them and be done with it. Often you have to put something back in, you have to fix that somehow. But when I do that, I try to write something new again, instead of like tinkering that weak sentence into something better. Appleseed is a long book, it has 2,500 paragraphs in it. And imagine at some point I did that to it. And I took out 2,500 sentences that were weaker than the other sentences in the book. And you can just, I mean, that's such a wild practice, right? But you feel that what's left is so much better. Like the things, and it of course does sometimes do things you're like, well, maybe I don't need this whole paragraph, right? You get in these, it makes you bold in a way. Very, very late in the process when you feel like you can't possibly read your prose anymore. I had a short story due for a magazine last month that it had to be under 6,000 words. My first draft was 12,000. At some point I got it down to 6,900, and I'm just like, I can't, there's no way I'm going to be able to crunch another 900 words out of this. And I did this weakest sentence thing. And when I was done with that pass, it was 5,900 words long, and it was tight, right? And no, I didn't take out any actions. I didn't take out any plot. I didn't take out any dialogue, right? I just I made the thing a little tighter. What's the part it doesn't need? And that feels really frightening, but it's you and a highlighter and a piece of paper, like you're not going to get hurt, like it'll be okay. And if it doesn't work out, you can always put it back. But I think it's been a useful way to like re-enter it. And I can see doing that in a poem or an essay or a memoir, right? I mean, it's the same kind of practice, like to not let there be weak things slowing down the project.
You several times in the book, you encourage the writer not to cut and paste.
Yeah.
Don't you?
Yeah, I mean, there is a time for cutting and pasting, right? Like I think at some point you're just moving things around, but I think early on in the stages, I mean, for me, the way my sentences work, I think I can't like take a scene from chapter 3 and just drop it in chapter 2 and have it work, right? Things before and after it have to be rewritten anyway. Like the cause and effect of the novel is not modular usually. So some of it's just like do the work of making it fit the first time by rewriting it. It may be really obvious as I'm talking about this, like my goal is not efficiency necessarily, right? My goal is like a great book. Like it's not like how fast can I write a book, but like how good of a book can I write? And yeah, I think I would rather have the time spent doing the hard work than do that, which is not to say that I do not get very lazy about things. As I said at the beginning, I definitely occasionally violate my own rules. And I'm like, this was a really good scene in the first draft. I can just drop it in the second. And it never works. I always end up having to redo it. And it just wastes my own time. But I of course, am absolutely like the laziest animal on earth and will find the way out if I can. Sure. So some of those rules are reminders to me as well, like do the work the first time so you don't have to do it twice, or 3 times.
Yeah. Hey, we're so glad you're on this call today. Appreciate all of your thoughts. I highly recommend picking up the book. One of you is going to get your name selected and get a copy in the mail. But before Matt hops off the Zoom, I wanted to make him available for any questions from what he might have shared, or just a question in general about writing fiction or nonfiction. So you just remember, if you have that question, unmute yourself so that we can all hear the question.
Yeah, I have a question. Hi, Matt. Thank you so much for being here. My question is what is the what is the writing practice that you swear by? Like, is it morning pages? Like, is there something that you do in order to prepare yourself to get into the flow that's been really helpful?
Yeah, I think morning page is a good way to say it. I think my ideal is to write, 4 or 5 days a week, like a couple hours at a time. When things are going really well, I'm working, 3-4 hours a day, usually in the mornings. I've been lucky to engineer my life for a long time now, where I don't start my other work until the afternoon. Usually, I'll be on campus from like noon to 8 or something, but I'll write in the mornings. And for me, I'm just freshest in the morning. I'm the most open. It's harder for me to, especially draft, once the rest of the world has sort of gotten its hooks in me, So like, it's 115 degrees here in the summer. Like an ideal writing day for me in the summer is like I get up and I go running at like 4 a.m. just because it's cool out, cooler. It's only like 90, and run in the dark. And then I come home and meditate and eat breakfast and read for a little bit. And then I write till lunch. And like when I have my time to myself, that's about it. When I'm drafting, I can only write like 2-3 hours at a time when I'm doing like a first draft. Like I just can't see very far into the book. Even if I had 15 hours to write, I wouldn't write for 15 hours, But when I get into revision, like late stage revision, I work really long hours because the only way to get the whole book in my head, like I can't, like when I'm drafting, I see very little of it at a time. So at the end, I work like 6 weeks, like 10-hour days or something, and I become like a movie novelist where I'm like insane and you can't really talk to me. I'm not fun to be around. My wife is like, will you please finish your book and like come back to earth? But most of the time I work a couple hours and then I feel very present in the rest of my life because I've done my thing for myself. You were asking about, I think you were maybe about to ask about like a spiritual component. And I'll just say like, the days in which I write and read, I feel more like myself than the days I don't. And I think that's one of the reasons to get to the desk, right? Like if I go a long time without writing, I start feeling very like thin as a person, not physically obviously, but like mentally thin. And so I think writing and reading are some of the things that like keep me myself in a certain way. Yeah.
Susan Fish, I know you're here somewhere. Oh, there we are. You had a question. So ask away.
Hey there. Thanks for this. I think the question I have, and this really resonates with me, it's a good description of my process. I have a poet friend who always says about poetry, get in as late as you can and get out as early as you can. Right. Which like usually it's cutting off that stuff that you've talked about. Like she always says, cut off the last line and see what happens. The question I have is, what are mistakes you see writers often making that maybe we could avoid making?
Yeah, I think one is related to what we were just talking about, and that's I think this like being very, very sure of what your novel is and not letting it become itself. I think I see people lose a lot of time to that. It's just being too sure. I have a grad student right now who was writing like a kind of crime thriller that's becoming kind of like fantastical in a certain way. And he's just like very resistant to it. He's like, I didn't think I was going to be writing a fantasy novel. I'm like, but it's so good. Like, just like give into your fantasy novel you're writing. It's really interesting to watch him refuse to move. I think the other big first draft problem I see over and over is too big of a timeline. Like the timeline is just far too expansive. Someone will be writing a set in middle school, right? And they'll do it over like all of middle school. And so everything becomes very diffused and the events become very like distant from each other. And what I usually suggest is like, it's kind of what you were saying, Susan, like getting in and getting out, like the shortest possible clock your story can be told on. And that putting that middle school novel even into summer break compresses it compared to like 4 years, right? Putting it into the week before the winter dance or something. And like everything happens during that time. And you just get like what Kundera calls like the beauty of a sudden density of events. When a lot of things are happening in life really fast, there's sort of a feeling that like anything is possible. And I think the novel benefits from that. And I'm saying this as a person whose last novel took place over 1,000 years. So like, I mean, like, like long time spans can be okay. But, in that, of course, I'm finding like urgencies inside that, right? As opposed to, I don't really narrate 1,000 years because the events get too far apart. In real life, of course, we have our cause and effects usually are spread pretty far apart. But I think for the purpose of the novel, like the tighter it can be set, the better. Sometimes that means looking for like a backdrop thing. I mentioned like a summer dance or something, but like 4th of July weekend is a more intense version of the whole summer, right? It's like 4th of July weekend is like what summer feels like, but it happens in a very short time period. Excuse me. So I think looking for like a smaller clock is good. I think part of what that's related to is this feeling in first drafts that anything you want the reader to understand, you have to show them. And so like if you're like, oh, this character's depressed, so you write like 10 scenes in which they're depressed, or this character's an alcoholic, so you see 10 scenes with them drinking. But the beginning of books is like a magical space. It's the premise. Anything you assert in the premise, the reader believes. So if on page 1 you say Matt is an alcoholic depressive who's going on a quest, we're just like, we get it, let's go, quest begins, like we sort of were like ready to go. So we'll believe you if you show us something once. We don't have to see a student be bullied for like 10 episodes. We get it, like this is a student who's bullied when we see it the first time. So I think that allows you to do more compression than you think is possible. But some of that showing it 10 times is you exploring and teaching yourself, right? So like that's that difference between what it will look like in the final and what it looks like in the draft. I hope that's helpful, Susan.
One of the lines in the book is, just going to read it. Because I know I'm inevitably going to rewrite so much of every novel and throw away so much of what I labored so hard over early in the process, I also try not to get too precious too early, leaving the final tune-up of my prose for later. And what I heard there is, I think too often writers fall in love with their writing.
Sure.
And obsess with it. And it's like, what could be said in 2 sentences becomes 3 pages or what have you.
Of course. Yeah. And I think, some of that is you should fall in love with your writing, right? Like I love working with language and making like a beautiful or well-constructed sentence is part of the joy. Even in that first draft, knowing I'm going to throw it away, I'm writing like the best possible sentences I can. That's part of the joy of writing, right? So I can't purposely write bad drafts. One thing that will help, of course, over time, this is probably true for many of you already, is the more you write, the less precious you are about like any given piece of it, right? I don't know, I probably published 500,000 words by now, and I probably, which seems insane, and I've probably thrown away 2 million, right? And you sort of have this like I'll write another sentence. I'll live to write another scene. Like, you know, like, but I think when you're writing like your first novel or your first book of poems, every chapter's cost you so much that the idea of like throwing it away feels impossible. And I understand that sort of emotion, of course. You know, one thing that maybe is helpful to hear is like all of my books were much bigger than they are in print at one point. I overwrite and cut back. That's just part of my process. Appleseed is 125,000 words long. It was 185,000, and that was in like a good draft, right? And then there was another like 100,000 words of material in like the cut file. So I wrote 300,000 words to get 125, and that proportion is about true for my other books. And it's really been true from the first. My first novel was called In the House Upon the Dirt Between the Lake and the Woods. When I sold the novel, it was 125,000 words long. It's published at 63. And part of when I sold it to my editor was like, they're like, the book's really long. And by then I had sort of like realized that myself. And I'm like, well, I'm already cutting it, you know? So I turned it back. I sold it at that length, but turned it back in at like 90,000. And then we cut another 30,000. And I would say in that whole cut, there is not like a scene taken out of the book. They were just overwritten, right? There was too much explanation. There's too much exposition, too much clog in the prose. And I'd written really beautiful clog that had to come out, right? You know, like the stuff we cut was as good as the stuff that's left in like a pure prose level, but it just was in the way of the reader's experience. And, you know, we cut 60,000 words out, and then at the very end, my editor was like, I think this sentence needs to be like a 3-page scene. And I wrote one more scene and expanded it a little tiny bit, and then we were done. You know, so I don't know, I've come to sort of trust that part of the process too, that I think you feel all that stuff that you wrote. That's the iceberg again, right? That's the iceberg, that stuff you take out. The reader feels that. It's not wasted, it's not lost. It's part of your process. I think of it as scaffolding a lot. The scaffolding holds the building up. You have to build the scaffolding. All that exposition, explanation, and extra prose is holding your book up while you write it. And then when you're done building your cathedral, you take the scaffolding off, you know? Some of that cutting is getting rid of the stuff you needed to write the book, but the reader does not need it to read it.
So good, so good. Tara, you have a question? Unmute yourself.
I am unmuted. Thank you so much for writing this. This is an interesting take for me because I'm the underwriter who tends to have just a scaffold and then doesn't want to remove any of it because it's so precious and necessary. I'm wondering how, as someone who approaches it from the other end and tends to feel like they know where they're going, and sometimes the structure doesn't always work. Right. You get to the end of your novel, and let's say however many words you have, you don't have that editor yet. We might have Dawn, which is fantastic. But how do we know what should be the distilled piece at the end? If we've made mistakes along the way, but we don't have a clear sense of like, this is really where the story was meant to be. Like your student who is writing a fantastic fantasy, but is still stuck on the crime. Like, is there a way of kind of sensing that your story should be going a different direction than what you had intended it to without having that editor set of eyes?
Yeah. I mean, some of it is like instinct, right? You have to sort of trust your own sort of like, I feel like I usually know when something's wrong, and sometimes I still am trying to like pass it off, right? You're like, I know this isn't quite as, you know, right? You're sort of hoping you can get away with it or something. And like, that's probably the stuff you need to fix. I think one thing that, when I talked about like reverse outlining a book, you know, and sort of looking at like the bones of it, when I'm doing that, what I outline is usually like just the action of the book in like the present timeline of the book, like the time narrated. And what I'm trying to see is like the cause and effect of the story. And but it can be kind of arbitrary. I don't always have my structure totally in hand at that point. And one of the things that's become useful is just like mapping it to an existing structure. Like if you think you're writing like a 3-act kind of thing, like I heard about the 3-act structure my whole creative writing education, but never really had it broken down. I didn't know what went in what act really, right? Except in a vague sense. But you know, you can just like buy a really formulaic screenwriting book like Save the Cat or something. Do Blake Snyder Save the Cat, which is one of these like this is how you write a screenplay kind of books. And it has this very clear structure. And so like with the book I'm writing now, when I did my outline, I like mapped it against that structure, not because I thought I was trying to write a formulaic book, but because that helped me see where like things were misproportional, or helped me see where something was missing, right? That like the inciting incident was happening on like a page 100 instead of 15 or something, right? And you're like, okay, like that's wrong. Or there's a part of his outline that he calls fun and games, which is like, this is the like 25 minutes to 45 minutes of movie where everything that's in the trailer is in that part. And I always like love like thinking about that in the novel, like where's like the fun and games part where you're just like playing out the premise. That's part of that. Where the end of Act 1, for instance, in a 3-act structure has to be, I think, a choice the protagonist makes that moves them out of the inciting incident material into like the proactive part of the novel where they're like trying to do whatever their want is. And that choice is often missing in a first draft. We just kind of like fall into the second act, you know, and like there's a place where your character needs to like, the reason they're the hero is because they decide to do the thing. Frodo says, I'm going to take the ring to Mordor, and the second act begins. Like if Frodo just like wanders to Mordor while looking for breakfast, like he's not a hero. He's just a guy who ended up in the right place. And so looking for those like choices that your characters are making. If they're not making them, then it's not there yet. If the choices aren't believable, then you're missing some part of the causality of the book. One of the most useful things I can maybe suggest is like at the scene level, and I think this is probably true in memoir as well. A scene begins with like want and ends with change, right? So if nothing has changed in a scene, then the scene is not complete, no matter how beautiful it is, no matter how interesting the description is. And it probably ends as soon as the change happens, right? That's that sort of get out when you can too. But the change creates the necessity for the next scene. So a character wants something, something happen, either discover something or resolve something, or it becomes more complicated. A character didn't know something, now they know something. That can be a scene. And that change that happens in that scene creates the necessity for the next scene. And when that's not happening is when it feels like your plot is not going anywhere, because your scenes are not creating the need for the next scene. But it's almost always in choice and change are the two things that create that necessity. So that's when you could just look at every scene in your novel draft and be like, what changed and what need does it create? And if your protagonist is not the person causing most of the change in the book, then I would look to try to make that the case, because then it's their story. If otherwise it's something that happens to them, right? This stuff's so easy when you talk about other people's novels, right? I have this enormous, messy novel I've been working over 2 years, and I'm like, this is such good advice. I'm gonna get off this call and go do all this. It's so easy to see in someone else's work, you know? Yeah.
So good. Matt, thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's always good to hear from people who not only write books about this, but are also doing it. So thank you so much for joining us, and we wish you well. Do you have a website that people can go to if they want to find out more about you?
I do. It's mattbell.com, so that's pretty easy. I also write a monthly like Substack newsletter at mattbell.substack.com that each month is like a craft essay and a creative writing exercise, and that might be useful to those of you. One of the things that talks about in the book is this reverse outline. This month's essay that's up there right now is about like how to do this kind of structure mapping we were just talking about. So that might be useful to a lot of you to check out. Thanks so much, Don. Thanks to all of you. Have a great day, and hopefully I'll see you all soon.
Take care.
Bye.
That's awesome. We have a few minutes. I always like to have a little bit of time before the end of this to hear from other Pape Commons writers. So there's a couple on here today that are cleaning their teeth or vacuuming. Don't know where that noise is coming from. So weird. I'm going to ask though Karen DeBleek she's on unmute and share briefly about your project you're working on.
I'm working on a novel, and initially it was for young adults. Or the one I'm working on right now?
Yeah, go ahead. Well, you started the one I messed you up with.
Oh. Well, the one that I have in with you is it's a Les Mis origin story set in the time of rum runners, the Temperance Society, and the KKK. And it sets in Canada in the 1920s, and it's the main character is biracial, so it explores issues of race and status, much like Les Miserables does as well. And it also digs into some history that lots of people don't know. So yeah, that's what I have in with you. And currently I was writing a young adult's that was a journal in the 1980s between a student and her teacher. It's an assignment that they have to write in every week. And it's kind of the relationship that grows between the two, and the teacher kind of helping her to navigate high school, but also her helping her teacher to navigate life. But I don't know what I'm going to do with that now.
Oh, and Karen, how many times have you seen Les Mis to inform you as to the novel you're writing? What blew my mind.
I read the abridged version in French in grade 8, and I've watched the Les Mis musical 10 times, and I read the tome twice.
Yeah.
I'm a little obsessive about it.
Seeing the musical once was enough for me. But anyway. Thank you, Karen. Greg Paul is on the screen as well. We have a little time to hear about your novel, Greg.
Oh, thanks, Don. Thanks for putting this thing together, and thanks to Matt. I'm working on a novel right now. Actually, I'm working on a second novel, but the one that I have with Dawn right now was my first fiction project. And for those of you who have been listening to Matt about writing and throwing stuff away, I've probably been writing it for 10 years, and I think finally I've gotten somewhere. But I've published a number of nonfiction books that are story-based. This book is a totally secular novel, and the central character is a First Nations man, an Indigenous man who grew up whose family was deeply affected by the residential school system. And as the novel opens, he's actually on life support in a hospital, and it's sort of a mystery at the heart of it, how he came to be there. But the critical part of what happens around it is that although he's a person who's been rejected by society because he was homeless and Indigenous, he gathers people around him. There's almost the creation of a family around him, and so in the process of that, people have to kind of review their own lives, their own priorities, and so some of the characters that are involved in that are a young woman who is also First Nations, who was involved, ran away from care, and it was involved very young in sex work. And a minister who's involved in a downtown church, which was my background for 30 years, which is how I came to these kinds of stories, working with people who struggle with addictions and so on. A young musician who's connected to the young woman, and there's a First Nations elder from up north who comes down to deal with the situation with the man who's on life support. So it's kind of a mystery about how he ended up there, but also a mystery about his life and his backstory that allows for kind of the uncovering of the tragedy of residential school stuff.
And so much of what Greg has done informs this book. Greg, do you want to just very quickly talk about your work in Toronto with Sanctuary?
Sure. I mean, I wouldn't dare write a story about that if I hadn't been really good friends with dozens upon dozens of Indigenous people who had experienced exactly those kinds of circumstances. So I feel in a way that I'm the holder of their stories and hopefully the deliverer of kind of a story that encompasses that. So for 30 years, and some years before that, but for 30 years I've been involved in a community in downtown Toronto called Sanctuary. I helped establish it and lead it for a bunch of years. And the people who are at the core of that community are folks who are poor, street involved, struggling with addictions, mental illness, trauma, of course, and a high percentage of those people are Indigenous people. So trying to not provide a service, not provide services, although we do that, but trying to be a community together that includes very privileged people like me, white guys who have never gone without a meal.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you.
And if you can mute yourself so we don't get this, there we go, feedback. If you want to read a really amazing book, God in the Alley was one of Greg's award-winning books, and it shares a little bit about his work. One of the fascinating things about Greg is these people he's writing about are his friends. So he's not making them up. They're not out of his brain, fantasy or imagination. They're real on live people. It's very moving. So thanks, Greg. Hey, I want to always honor our 45-minute commitment because I know everyone has busy schedules and are joining mid-morning, whatever, or from wherever. Ella is in Australia and about to go to bed or wake up. I'm not sure where you're at in the world, but it's good to see you on the screen here. And we'll hear from her project down the road. It's very cool. Our next, these happen the third Thursday of every month. So the next one is going to be Ellen Graff Martin. She is going to share with us about social media marketing. She has a company that does that up in Canada. And so Ellen's going to join us and talk a little bit about how do we grow the social media? How do you go from an unknown author to a known author in social media, that is. If you're an unknown author, you can join an unknown author club. We'll hear more about that at a later date. But anyway, hope you can join me on the third Thursday of April, which is the 21st at 10 a.m. Mountain Time. It is great to see you all. Have a great rest of your day and happy St. Patrick's Day. Take care.